Erica is an environmental protection officer with the District of North Vancouver. I should note that Erica has to dash out at 12:45 with the heavy rains. Anybody who knows the landscape of the District of North Vancouver and the North Shore will know that heavy rains often mean problems with sediment and erosion control. So Erica's got to do a site visit at 1 o'clock. So we'll hopefully be able to get to questions for her. And if not, remember, just put your questions into the questions box in your GoToWebinar console, and we'll be able to actually be able to archive those questions in the event that I'm not able to answer them. All right, Erica, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Pamela, and thank you for asking me to speak today. I hope I will leave time for some questions. But today I'm going to talk about development permit areas, mainly to do with single-family lots on the North Shore, and specifically to do with one of our 5 development permit areas, the Protection of the Natural Environment, DPA. So I'm going to say the term DPA a lot. That's what it is, development permit area. So the District of North Vancouver is a very unique environment for both developers and homeowners. We have a fairly unique topography where there are many, many watercourses running across, next to, in front of single-family lots, and where our air setbacks just cannot be met. Single-family lots on the North Shore in the DNV are not exempt from our 5 development permit area requirements, and homeowners are often very unaware of the existence of a development permit area and don't know what to make of them. We also rely on a QEP model, so we require professionals to provide reports and recommendations to homeowners, which we then review. And another unique thing about the district, maybe not as unique as it was a while ago, is that a single-family lot for redevelopment now goes for over $1 million. So a quick MLS search I did today showed all redevelopment lots on the North Shore for going far greater than that. So it's just something to keep in mind when we have this conversation about development permit areas. So I'm just showing you an example of a very common building site in the District of North Van. You have the confluence of 2 watercourses located well within a single family lot, and we get dozens of these a month that come in for redevelopment. So I'll talk a little bit more about the challenges of this type of lot in just a little bit, but I thought I'd provide you a visual of what we deal with on a day-to-day basis. So the challenges for us, setbacks are often very hard to meet. The photo you're seeing now is a lot in the municipality near Deep Cove, where the creek is daylighted on either side of this house and culverted underneath it. So there are a lot of things we have to deal with these single-family lots, and staff and QEPs struggle with redevelopment questions when it comes to these constrained lots. And we acknowledge that our language in our development permit guidelines around species at risk is very vague at the moment, and we are committed to changing that. So just a little bit of information about single-family building permits. This is District of North Van specific, so you can see we have an upswing in permits, especially for new single-family homes over the past 5 years, and we're actually at a critical turnover point for our single-family housing stock. Houses built in the 1950s are now up for renewal, so we're seeing a big uptick in single-family permits. This graph only goes to 2015, but I can tell you that the numbers are climbing for 2016 and 2017 for major renovations, but especially new single-family building permits. So it's kind of an interesting thing to keep in mind when we're talking about these development permit issues, is the number of homes that are going to be built. So this is just what I was speaking to. Houses built in the 50s are now reaching their critical turnover point, and that's why we're seeing this upswing in new single-family building permits. And we're going to be seeing that in the next 5 years. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with our DNV development permit areas, but we have 5, and they're all listed in our OCP: the protection of the natural environment, our streamside protection, slope hazard, wildfire hazard, and creek hazard DPAs. These are all administered by our environment group. So we're a team of 5, and we also work in planning. And these are the 5 that some lucky homeowners can find their houses situated in all 5 of them. So just quickly, I thought I'd touch on the 3 natural hazard DPAs. So the goal of these is to protect development from hazardous conditions. So we have a wildfire hazard, creek hazard, and slope hazard. And we rely heavily on a QP model for natural hazard areas. And the goal of these is to protect people and property. So I'm not going to touch too quickly or too much on these ones. So I'm going to skip ahead. And this is what we're here to talk about today. So environmental protection for us is the protection of the natural environment, its ecosystems, and biological diversity. And we use 2 development permit areas to do this: the protection of the natural environment DPA and our streamside DPA. So we define natural environment protected area as an area in which protection, conservation, or enhancement is required in order to protect mature stands of trees, habitat for species at risk, wetlands, raptor nesting sites, or wildlife corridors, as the case may be. Now that's a lot of language, but we're trying to protect areas in order to protect species at risk. So typically in our municipality, that means areas with large stands of trees that are not located within our streamside development permit area. And we've also tagged all school property as something that falls within the protection of the natural environment. Many of our schools have woodlot areas, and we just made the decision to include them all within this development permit area. Now, one of the reasons I'm talking to you today is when we prepared our OCP, this development permit area had the least amount of time spent on it. And as I said earlier, we've committed to enhancing this development permit area in the next 2 years. So we got to the point where our streamside DP was fairly well fleshed out, and we had to get moving forward with our OCP. So we acknowledge that this particular one of our development permit areas needs work. So this is what we're going to be working on next. So just to recap, this is the North Shore, if you're not familiar with the area, and you can see that we have many, many watercourses, and there are more, but this is just the layer I've decided to show. And this is our mapped protection of the natural environment DPA. So the goal of this DPA is to minimize development while at the same time not sterilizing a property, which is always a challenging goal to have. So now our work is on refining the requirements around this natural environment DPA, because we feel that we might be missing some things with the current mapping system, and this would allow us to be more specific in our requests of QEPs. The feedback we've heard in the last 5 years of having these development permit areas is that this particular DPA is far too vague and hard for QEPs to work under. So the question that I'm asked multiple times a day, but I just want a building permit. We hear this from realtors, developers, homeowners, contractors, concerned neighbors, even QEPs, QPs, and staff in other departments. So these are the questions that we are trying to help people with in real time at our front building counter. So it's a challenge. So if a project can't be exempted, we have a very specific list of exemptions per DPA. You need to hire a QEP or a QP, and a report is required to be submitted to us. Staff reviews reports, and we work closely with applicants, neighbors, realtors, that whole list, to make necessary changes. Sometimes we don't agree. Homeowners have a very different expectation for protection than staff, we find, and it is really hard to bridge that gap. And we acknowledge that QEPs and QPs are in a really tough position as they are hired by developers and owners to ultimately obtain development and building permits from the municipality. So we realize that this is a really challenging situation. So this is a this is in our OCP, and we need to work on this. So we have a graphic that shows we'd like you to build your house far away from the trees and not within them. The comments we get from QEPs are that we need to provide much more specific guidance. In our streamside development permit area, we list actual setbacks and distances from top of bank, and we do not include that kind of information in this development permit area. So we are committed and looking to change this to provide more information. So I'm going to make a case for eDNA now, which is a roundabout way of coming back to my species at risk focus here. So we are trying to make the case that staff should be able to perform eDNA tests in the environment so that we can further enhance and potentially modify our development permit area for protection of the natural environment. And we think this is a very valuable tool that we could use to protect species at risk. We currently have limited data about species distribution, so we're putting together a request to have staff trained and equipment bought so that we can use eDNA to enhance our protection of the natural environment development permit area. We've done a lot of trapping projects, mainly for Pacific water shrew, but as you all know, these are really expensive and time-consuming, and we're looking for another way and another tool that we can use to further enhance that development permit area so that we can provide that feedback to proponents. So I thought it's always nice to see a success story. So I thought I'd touch on some of the projects that we're involved in. So this is our before of Roche Creek. It's in Deep Cove. So this photo is showing you a heavily industrialized shipyard that was located adjacent to Roche Creek. Roche Creek is actually in a pipe under that building. And there were large amounts of contamination present on the site with a minimal riparian buffer area. Hardscaping was present that extended and limited the estuarine habitat. Now, an after photo, this has actually been built, but I thought I'd show you this graphic. We had the creek daylighted as part of a redevelopment of the site, so we had quite a bit of input on this project. A larger riparian corridor was established, native riparian planting was done, and actually a really interesting intertidal marsh area was planted. So the contamination was removed from the site during all of this work, and restoration would not have been possible without collaboration through development. So this is where our development permitted areas can be a really great tool, and we hope that when we can enhance the protection of the natural environment, DPA, we can provide better feedback to QEPs. So that would be our goal, is to change that development permit area by providing more information so that development can take place while protecting species at risk. And I think that's actually all I have, so it looks like there's a lot of time for questions. Thanks, Pamela.
All right, and thank you very much, Erica. Just going to switch back to me. All right, so for those of you that are on the call and on the webinar right now, if you've got any questions, just a reminder, please plug them into the question box on your console, or the other way you can do that is if you want to use the chat box, that's fine as well. Erica, I actually have a question for you, giving folks some time here. And then I'm actually going to also I also have a question for Allison, so I'm going to ask her as well. Afterwards, you guys don't get to escape quite so quickly. So Erica, in regards to the eDNA, so eDNA is environmental DNA, and it's kind of a very new sort of high-tech, sexy way of actually detecting the fingerprint or signature of a particular living organism's genetic characteristics. It literally sort of is designed to identify the presence of a particular living organism in the environment. There's been a lot of advances in using it in aquatic environments, and I know that they're working on refining the ability to do soil sampling for eDNA as well. How do you see this as actually being a tool for local governments? You're actually the first local government that I am aware of that's actually been looking at that as a sort of a mechanism for building more of a database of what, say, species at risk you have.
We were going to use it. Now, I haven't been approved for it yet, but I've put in the case to have.
Fingers crossed for you.
Yes, fingers crossed for hopefully next year. As you said, it's presence and absence sampling only. So what we would hope to do is add a layer to our mapping system that could show presence, absence, and then we would require people to do further work if we have determined that an area does have a species at risk present. So it gives us a better starting point to have people do the work required to get that development permit. So we see it as a way to guide people to look for the right thing, because right now we have such a broad map that's so open-ended. We think it will provide a way to really have people drill down into an area if they know something is present or not, to provide that protection required. So we're really hoping to get it, and we're really hoping it'll help us clear up some questions around that map. Does that help answer your question?
Sure. I've also got one. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say the soil sampling piece is coming along, so we're hoping to be able to do both once we get the okay.
And I have one that's I'm going to actually go from the most recent question and then work backwards, because I think this one is one for both you, Erica, and Allison. So just have a question from Glenn Dunsworth, and he asks, how do you vet QEPs regarding conflict of interest given their employer given conflict of interest given their employer, and would that be easier if the employer was you? So, Glenn, I think you're asking about sort of this proposal that's been floating around for quite some time, that the QEPs, rather than being retained by a proponent, would actually be a third party that was retained by the regulatory body at various levels of government to undertake any of the assessments and review, and ideally to provide more objective responses. And I got a big yes, so that is what he's getting at. So for both of you, because you both are QEPs yourself, theoretically, you're both RP bios, and on top of that, you both work with QEPs quite a bit. So for both you, Erica and Allison, how do you see actually dealing with reducing that sort of perceived conflict issue that crops up with the QEP use? Erica, you go first.
Yeah, I'll go first. I don't have a very good answer for this. We talk about this a lot, and I know some municipalities have a pre-approved list of QEPs that they would like contractors and homeowners to hire, and we haven't gone down that road yet, but we have talked about doing it. We have been getting advice from our legal department on that, and I'm not quite sure where we stand, but I agree it's a big challenge, and we haven't found a good way to address it, so I'm open to suggestions on that front. Totally open. We've talked about a pre-approved list where people could choose, but we haven't gone down that road yet.
Okay, Allison, any reflections on that issue?
Well, I guess I would say that, of course, this is in the air. We're talking about it because of the interest in reviewing the reliance on professionals model, and as some of you may know, both Pamela and I have been involved in doing ethics training in the past on behalf of or at least for me, it's in the past on behalf of the Association of Professional Biology. So, I mean, in my job, I get to talk to a variety of different stakeholders, government staff, local government folks, QEPs, landowners, and you kind of get a range of perspectives on this, and I think it's easier to perceive that the problem is just with poor quality QEPs when you're only looking through one lens or through one window. I think I think there are significant issues with the reliance on professionals model that we're going to have to work through. But I think one of the interesting ideas we've been batting around here is perhaps the idea of recognizing that the kinds of situations where we have difficulties working with qualified professionals and where local governments sometimes have difficulty getting the kind of information presented in the way they'd like, and they run into difficulties there, that perhaps what we could do is have the ability in complex development situations to ask for specifically highly qualified QEPs. So, you know, rather than sort of playing the preference game and saying, well, there's these 3 or 4 people that I work with really well, and so I want them on a list and I want them to get the vast majority of work. Maybe what we need is to have a kind of a pre-qualifying process where we define who are the recognized species at risk experts, for example, and when you have a development that needs a species at risk expert, the local government has some mechanism to enable those someone on that list to be involved. Because I feel like the sort of simple, straightforward developments can be done by lots of different QEPs effectively, but where sometimes we run into trouble is where something's got a lot of overlapping issues. And Pamela will probably agree with me that what you find when you're trying to define your area of competence in practice, it's often easy to know the things you know a lot about, and it's easy to know the things you know nothing about. But it's the middle ground where you get yourself in trouble. So I think a lot of times people get into a development that looks simple on the front of it. It gets more and more complex. They get in over their heads, and you've sort of committed and said you're competent, and then it starts to get really difficult and people get dug in. The last thing I would say, though, is I also really believe that a lot of our problems have to do with not making expectations clear at the beginning. And I do believe that a lot of problems would disappear with mandatory pre-assessment meetings where local governments get together with QEPs and landowners and spell out their expectations so that nobody after the fact can say, well, I didn't know I had to do this.
Mm-hmm. There was a very Rumsfeldian comment there about the unknown unknowns on that middle ground part of things.
Right.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, it's the issue about QEP reliance, working on species at risk issues is one that comes up in conversation almost every time that I have meetings with local government staff, or that the SCCP has workshops or other professional development opportunities focused on species at risk, or, you know, in general the environmental regulatory landscape. And definitely, I know that many of the municipalities that the SCCP works with have limited capacity, so they don't have in-house qualified professionals to do sort of the vetting and to do screening, or those staff may not actually be supported to review environmental assessment reports or refuse them. There's a lot of different sort of machinations that go on across the board, especially in the Lower Mainland, because we have so many different municipalities, and they don't all have sort of the same playing field when it comes to environmental policy, and that especially goes for species at risk. Perhaps one of the things that, you know, from a species at risk lens we need to think about is having more of, from the regulatory side, more certification requirements, the way that they do is for the riparian area regulation. And I know that, you know, a lot of people may be rolling their eyes and going, ugh, you know, when you think about RAR. But it does have a certification process where people have to go through a particular course, and if they don't take that course, they're not actually certified to do those types of assessments. You know, I think that, as you mentioned, Alison, the opening up of the professional reliance review by the province of BC and their commitment to dealing with species at risk legislation is going to provide hopefully some interesting opportunities for organizations like the SOSCP and the SCCP, and especially local governments, to help work towards a more of a consistent approach and practice for dealing with species at risk. Alison, I had a couple of questions from you from Katerina Mazzari. She had a question in regards to your presentation around the issue of logging in some of the areas where you sort of have that shared planning responsibility, and she was asking, how do you protect forest ecosystems from overlogging? I'm not sure if that's actually something that you specifically get involved with. And then also she was asking about Roche Creek and how did you remove contamination from Roche Creek?
Sorry. Well, I'm not sure I know where Roche Creek is. I wonder if that might be in another...
sorry, that would be, maybe that was Erica. Sorry, yeah. Erica, was that you? I'm sorry.
Yeah, Roche is ours, yeah. So,
okay, well, you want to answer the Roche Creek thing, and I'll go to the other one.
Sorry about that.
So sorry. The question about Roche was which one, Pamela?
So the question is, how did you actually remove the contamination from Roche Creek?
Yeah, so it has become a residential multifamily site now. So a contractor did do that work. That's what they did, and it was taken off site and not remediated on site. But I'm not involved with the particulars of that. We review post-construction and post-soil removal reports, but as far as how, that's not something that we would have dealt with. Sorry, I don't have a very good answer to that one.
So maybe the way to answer that is that there was a third party that was retained.
Yes. Yes, there was.
Decontamination aspect of things.
And then we review reports and monitoring reports to make sure that it was completed.
Right.
So while we're not on the ground, we do review them.
Right. And so is there monitoring as part of that to make sure that the remediation was effective?
Yes, there's a lot of monitoring on the site, both to make sure that the planting, the riparian and the estuary planting work over time, so that this is not just a walk away after it's been planted. We look at these for years afterwards, and then I'm sure we've got some monitoring wells in there to look at the contamination issue and ensure that it's all been removed. So yes, this is not one where we'll walk away. Okay, so
let's get back to Katerina's first question, which I think was for you, Alison. And forgive me, Katerina, if you can type something in there if I'm not asking the right person in regards to protecting sort of some of the forested landscapes from overlogging as part of the work that you do and the partnerships you're involved with.
So if we're talking about the way things operate in the Okanagan, because my role is primarily working with local government, I would only get involved in forestry discussions if they involved private land or if there was a referral to local government that they asked me to comment on, and that hasn't happened very often. In my past life, I was a forest ecosystems specialist in the Merritt Forest District, so I do have a lot of experience with that, and I can certainly provide advice when I'm asked to, but generally that doesn't overlap with the work that we do. That's something that the provincial government folks look at. It also sometimes comes to us as issues around forestry might come to us through our partners where issues were identified about impacts to species at risk or to conservation properties. But generally speaking, it hasn't been a big thing that I've been working on over the past 5 years that I've been in this position.
Okay. Thank you. I have a follow-up question on the QEP issue. I know that one always opens up a lot of interest. From Brad Langman, who's asking, would it help to have a species at risk critical habitat checklist for QEPs?
So that's an interesting question, and certainly we are working on that. Our rapid environmental assessment process has some of those things, and I think we are examining what needs to happen further. I have to say that, you know, I'm a person who really believes that, you know, our default setting when we see problems is to think about what other people could do to solve those problems. And I think that happens particularly in environments where people are really busy and they don't have enough time to do the things they've already been given. But I I think it's fair to say that the only way that change is going to happen is if you act within your area of influence. And so, for me, I'm constantly trying to figure out why I don't see a lot of, I find a lot of the assessment reports submitted that I review fail to identify critical habitat, or don't appropriately address attributes, or don't identify what attributes are on the property. And so I do a fair amount of training. I talk to a lot of QEPs about this, but we're also looking towards January or February. The province and the federal government are going to deliver a training effort in the Okanagan for QEPs, and I think this is one of the things they're going to talk about, and the concept of checklists is there. I think the challenge for us in the Okanagan is that we have so many species at risk, and I expect it's the same for you on the coast, and the actions that you need to address each species at risk, it isn't something that translates easily into a checklist.
Mm-hmm. Erica, any reflections on that?
Well, I think a checklist is good in theory, and I think having some broad things to cover off would be great. I go back to, I really like the idea of having well-qualified QEPs, because they would be able to really understand what's needed on a site, and I go back to questions that I would like the QEPs to be able to answer. So a checklist is good, but again, who's administering? I go from the regulator side. Who's owning that checklist? Who's telling people to use it? Who's checking it? So I see some issues there, and I really liked the conversation that we had around having well-qualified QEPs, and that is where I would tend to put some focus.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Pamela, as an example, the Woodbridge property example that I showed, where we'd protect the Lewis's woodpecker habitat, how we actually achieved that protection was by SOSCP hiring a very highly qualified QEP to essentially highlight the importance of that site. And so, it doesn't even have to be a QEP provided by the developer. Conservation organizations or other advocates can provide that information to local government, and it can have an influence on the outcome.
Okay, excellent. And I should add that one of the projects that was covered off, or I should say a couple of things that were covered off in our previous webinars. We had Scott Barrett from the provincial government with what was then Forest Lands and Natural Resource Operations. They've now added rural development to that. From Plinro, Scott was talking about the Baselines initiative that the province is undertaking, and it's really being spearheaded out of the South Coast Regional Office here, which looks at actually creating a series of checklists around stewardship requirements and expertise requirements for undertaking really large-scale environmental impact assessments. And I think that kind of thing could potentially, again, those are the types of things we could see transferred out in the long term to ensure that qualified professionals are undertaking projects, especially around species at risk, that they at least are able to definitively commit to having the expertise to undertake those sorts of things. The other project that was mentioned in our webinar from last spring was talking about the critical habitat decision support tool that I'm working on for the SCCP right now. And one of the components that's in there, because it's really focused more for developers and landowners trying to navigate the whole issue of, oh, what do? I've got critical habitat on my property. Was to actually create a checklist, a very simple checklist for landowners to actually help them screen QEPs that they may be retaining, because in most instances they will likely have to retain a QEP as soon as they start dealing with critical habitat issues on their property. And it's really important, I think, for landowners to actually have, this is coming from obviously the other end, but having landowners the ability, giving them the ability to ask informed questions of the experts that they are retaining, to provide them with services, to ensure that they're at least doing a little bit of better screening with the folks that they do end up retaining for those services. Just checking to see if we have any further questions. Looks like we don't. I have one last one. Erica, I'm not sure if you need to dash off right now. How things are going for you?
You'll have to go in about 4 minutes.
Okay, thanks very much. My last question is actually for Allison, and this is kind of just also based on experience that we have here on the South Coast and working, because we have such a plethora of local governments who are all sort of coming at things from a sometimes a very different perspective when it comes to species at risk obligations and responsibilities and how they're working that into municipal bylaws. Allison, I'm curious how you found it in regards to the project that the SCCP initiated around having a shared planner. Was there any challenges or difficulties in sort of getting buy-in from the regional district or municipal partners for that? And has there been any sort of learning outcomes now that it's been, or you've been actually been doing that for a number of years?
So just help me clarify your question, Pamela. You're asking, were there challenges in getting buy-in for the project or challenges in getting buy-in relative to species at risk and critical habitat?
No, buy-in for the project, like having your position actually created. Was there any resistance or?
So, you know, I think I wasn't around when they first negotiated this, so that predates me. There were two environmental planners in my position, one for about 18 months and one for about a year before I came in. So I can't directly speak to how the negotiations went, but you know, I would say the overarching document that we had was the Biodiversity Strategy, and it identified essentially actions for senior government, which was the province or the federal government, and actions for local governments. And some of those actions were very difficult to achieve without somebody to support local governments in getting there. So they identified things like the need for updating official community plans to strengthen environmental content and address things like development permit areas. And so local governments, as a supporter and a partner of SOSCP, and as participants in the development of the biodiversity strategy, I think they could see that they needed this support. So kind of embedded in this, there was a bunch of talking that happened before and planning documents that sort of pointed to the need for this. But I would also say in my experience of the 5 years I've been in this job, that what you see is there are early adopters, there are people that watch to see how it goes for others carefully and jump in as soon as they see that it's working well, and then there are some local governments that are resistant. And we've been seeing a progress as we succeed with one local government. We have another local government that has growing interest and participation. So, you know, I would say, honestly, like I described in my talk, some of the barriers and the concerns that were there at the beginning, and these days, I think a lot of those are reduced. We still have challenges. I mean, any group of people that work together have challenges, but generally, I think there's support for the model, and I think most of us feel that it's providing a reasonable solution to a difficult problem.
Excellent, thank you. It looks like that's all the questions that we've got. Allison, I don't know if there's any sort of last words that you'd like to have, because you're flying solo right now. Erica has had to go attend to some work-related issues out there in the rainy landscape.
No, I think I've said my piece. Thank you for the opportunity.
All right, and I'd also like to thank everyone else for attending this morning. We really appreciate having the opportunity to share this sort of information with you, and the fact that people do sign up for these webinars and is a really good indication that we're on the right track in providing this information. Our next webinar, as I mentioned, is going to be in the spring of 2018. We usually try to do them fall and spring. And at this point in time, the SCCP is still kind of discussing what the theme of that one is going to be. We might be looking more on the science of conservation side of things rather than the policy aspects or the regulatory aspects. But stay tuned, and if you want to learn more about the SCCP, you can go to our homepage at sccp.ca and sign up for a newsletter. You can also like us on Facebook, and social media and our RS feeds and our website are the best way to keep in touch with the type of work we're doing, but also updates on any events and professional development opportunities that we're doing in the given year. So on behalf of the Canadian Society for Environmental Biologists, I'd really like to thank them for supporting us for the webinar platform today, and look forward to working with them again in the springtime for our next webinar. And again, also thank you to Environment and Climate Change Canada and the Habitat Stewardship Program for Species at Risk for providing the funding to actually move forward with providing these types of opportunities. So thanks again, and hopefully we'll see you in the spring. And if you have any questions, you can email me directly at pamela@sccp.ca. Thanks very much.